Yeah, I don't know.
Mine kept flipping though, like it'd be fine and then all of a sudden it would.
That's really strange. Yeah, so I'm just waiting for some people to join it. There were like 30 people, but I threw them all out by stopping it. Okay, so it looks like we're getting a few more people joining again, and Todd Bridge has joined. Todd, can you tell me, it's still vertical? I don't understand what could possibly be going on here. What?
Do you have the lock on your phone? You know how you can
Yeah.
rotation lock?
Yeah, let me try that.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting on mine, but then it does that.
Okay. Anything from last time, so I don't know why it would. So Todd, it's not horizontal, it's vertical? Yes, okay. I honestly don't know what to do.
Just hold your phone the other way and
How does it look when I turn my phone this way? Does it look vertical again? I apologize. So now it's showing you it as vertical? Yes, okay, I'm gonna go with it because I don't wanna waste any more time. I apologize again for my struggles here, but this is, I guess we still have more learning to do about Facebook Live. Okay, so I'm gonna
pay for it.
I'm gonna start by introducing the dogs and again introducing our topic, which today we're gonna talk about heads. And so even though I haven't figured out the stabilizer, hopefully it's not gonna matter as much. But next time we'll try to get this to work better. Okay, so again, I'm gonna introduce our dogs. First, we have 3 of the same dogs that we had last time, and we have 1 new dog. So I'm going to quickly remind you this, for anyone who didn't watch last time, this is Beulah. Beulah is a 6-year-old female. Beulah is 140 pounds. This is Sky. Sky is an 8-year-old female. Sky is 100 pounds. This is True. True is a 2-year-old female. True is 105 pounds. And lastly, our new addition is we needed a male dog. So this is McCoy. McCoy is 8 years old and McCoy is 135 pounds. Okay, so Todd's telling me the picture is correct, just vertical, but we're gonna just go with it because this is working for now. So in talking about heads today, one of the things that I was thinking is that at some level in the Newfoundland, heads aren't really that important because Newfoundlands are working dogs and they need to be able to swim, they need to be able to pull a cart, they need to be your companion, they need to be able to, be your pet, they need to be able to, do obedience. There's so many things our dogs do as working dogs. So why do we care about heads? But then I thought about it again, I thought heads are incredibly important in Newfoundlands because how do we tell the difference between a Newfoundland and a Labrador Retriever, a flat-coated Retriever, a Bernese Mountain Dog? How do I look at a dog and know that this dog is a Newfoundland? And a lot of things about the Newfoundland in the Standard tell us about their body, their size, but the head is so essential. When you look at the head of a Newfoundland, you know right away, this is a Newfoundland. This is what you want to see. And the other thing that's really important is even though we love our dogs to do working activities, we spend a lot of time just looking at our dogs. Like when you're watching Netflix and you have a bowl of popcorn and your Newfoundland is begging for popcorn and staring at you, you want to be able to look at a beautiful face. So it's interesting because is the head important? Yes, it is. So we're going to talk about several different aspects of the head. So the first thing is the overall head and expression. Then we're going to focus on eyes, ears, and muzzle. And we're going to then have a conclusion about some of the things that we learned when we did some measuring of the different head pieces of these 4 animals. So first of all, I'm going to tell you what the standard says, and I'm going to try to show you quickly. In the illustrated guide, there's a picture of 2 ideal heads. There's a dog on the left and a bitch on the right. And I realized maybe we should have referred to the Newfoundland illustrated guide in our last video because this is a really good place for a way to visualize the standard. we want to read the standard and we want to know what does it mean. And the illustrated guide is kind of like our assistant there that helps us understand what some of the language is. So in the standard, the overall description of the head is that it is massive with a broad skull, a slightly arched crown, and a strongly developed occipital bone. And there are also well-developed cheeks. So I'm going to zoom in and we're going to get ready to do exactly what we're talking about when we talk about some of these things. The other thing that's important, which is one of the key things in the standard, is the expression of the Newfoundland. The number one thing it tells you is the expression is soft. It reflects dignity. So these, I think, are 4 elements that are key to the Newfoundland and what a Newfoundland head should look like. So some of the measurements of Beulah's head quick.
Yeah, tell me which one.
Okay, so we're going to start with some of these overall measurements. So let's start measuring we're going to determine if the skull is broad. So we decided to try to determine if the skull was broad by measuring across the top of the skull.
So the first thing I did is, we did this on the table beforehand, but I sort of held vertical and just held like 2 points vertical and then measured straight across.
And on Beulah's head, when we did this measurement, we found that her skull width was about 7 inches. And whether there was an arched crown or not, the top of the ear to the top, the top of one ear to the top of the other ear. And instead of measuring straight across, now we're measuring over the top to try to represent that arch. And when we did this measurement, we came up with 9 inches. Of whether her skull is broad and whether it's arched. So if these measurements are more similar, then that's going to mean the skull is less arched and we have less of a broad crown. So in looking at the overall Newfoundland, we also talk about having a so why don't we point out the occipital bone is actually pretty far back at the back. And so you want to be able to really feel that bone sticking out. And one of the other things the standard mentions is that, jumping a little bit ahead to muzzle, because this is a good time to point it out, is that the length of the muzzle from the stop to the end of the muzzle is shorter than from the stop to the occiput. And so I'm going to try to show you. Steve's hands are kind of in there, but you can see we're not as much shorter than the distance to the stop to the end of the muzzle is much shorter than the stop to the occiput. And you can imagine in other breeds that's not the case, but in Newfoundlands, I think the stop to the occiput is a lot larger. Okay, so we want to mention overall, because again, the overall head, the forehead, and so I think if you zoom in and you look closely at the face, you can see that there are a couple lines on the side of Beulah's muzzle, but for the most part, her forehead and face are free of wrinkles. And it's interesting, in some cases, I feel like they're wrinkles, and in other cases, I wonder if it's a pattern of hair growth. But in any case, that's something that the standard does not prefer. We're supposed to have a forehead and face that are smooth and free of wrinkles. So let's just quick look at each dog down the line. Sky's head. And you can see Sky is another example where she does have a little bit of wrinkling on the side of her muzzle. And we will go and measure Sky's head as well. But first, we're going to just look overall and look at the expression and look at the overall soft, benevolent, dignified. We're looking for all those things that I just talked about. So coming down to the end, here's McCoy. So we've looked at all 4 of the heads now. So the other thing that I want to point out, which I think maybe it'll be good to do this with True, is that the standard also mentions that the slope of the stop is moderate, but may appear abrupt in profile. So when we look here at True, let's point out where, okay, Steve's pointing to the stop. And so you can see that the slope of her stop, not her most flattering look, but the slope of the stop from this angle, it's not that extreme. It's more moderate. But when you look at the occipital bones or the brow ridge, you can see that it makes it look more abrupt. And when you fluff the hair up, again, this makes the stop look abrupt in profile, but it's not really very abrupt. I think we can see the same thing if we look at Sky. In profile, her stop definitely looks abrupt. But again, if you flatten down the hair, you'll find out that it's actually more moderate And you'll also be able to see the brow ridges here that make it look more abrupt. Okay, so those are the main features of the overall head. So now we're gonna go on to the next aspect of the head, which is the eyes. So I'm gonna go back down to Beulah again, and we'll look at her eyes. So the first thing are dark brown. So darker is better. They should be a dark color. And it turns out that when they're lighter or they're poorly shaped, it can affect the dog's expression. And today, I don't know that we have a dog with us who has very light eyes. They're mostly dark brown, but maybe Beulah's and True's are a little lighter. So you can think about whether or not you feel like that affects the expression of these particular dogs.
And from last time, if you look, Avery's eyes are a bit lighter.
Yeah, and so Avery last time did have a little bit lighter eyes, but we don't have her with us today. So the eyes are also supposed to be relatively small and deep set. One thing that we discovered, we measured all of the eyes, and we did find that almost all of the dogs here, it was pretty standard. Almost all the eyes we measured from the one corner of the eye to the other. And McCoy's were maybe a little wider, maybe 1 1/4 inches, but in all honesty, that's not surprising. So I was a little bit, I expected to see more variation in some of the measurements of the heads than I actually did. So you can see all 3 of those girls, even though their heads look different and their eyes look like slightly different shapes, the measurement is about the same. So maybe the shape of the eye is more important than the actual measurement. That the eyes are spaced wide apart. So we actually measured the distance between the eyes. And do you have the measurer? When we measured, we found that her eyes were about 3 inches apart. So you can see that. And I think her eyes are spaced pretty widely apart. So let's go down the line.
Are they all the same?
They actually, surprisingly, were kind of all the same. So even though I think when you look at Sky's head, the measurement between her eyes is also 3 inches. Truey's head, again, relatively different look to her head. When you measure between her eyes,
Just shy of.
it's just under 3 inches. And now McCoy, I think his may have been slightly long,
I think we did
slightly different as 3 1/2.
3 1/4, 3 1/2, yeah.
So maybe since the dog's head is a little larger, the eyes are slightly further apart. But the 3 bitch heads, which I think again that these 3 bitch heads, but the measurement between the eyes was pretty close to the same. Fit closely without inversion. So you want to see that the eyelids are close around the eye. They're covering most of the eye. We don't see the eyes bulging. The eyes aren't round. Those are the kind of things that will affect the expression of the eye. One thing to note is that Sky's, so if you want to know what it looks like, you can see that if you look closely into her eye, that there's a little bit of tearing because her eye is rolling a little bit. An older dog. So sometimes you also see that happen more in older dogs than when they're younger. Okay. So after eyes, we're going to move on to talk a little bit about ears. We also found more consistency than we expected when we measured ears. The ears are relatively small and they're triangular with rounded tips. So let's zoom in on Beulah's ear here. And there's her ear, relatively small and triangular with a rounded tip.
Especially.
And when we measured Skylar, Beulah, and McCoy's ears, they were all 7 inches long. From the fold of the ear to the tip, which was a little surprising because they have slightly different size heads. The only difference was that True's ear was a little bit shorter.
Like
True's ear was
1 inch, yeah.
6 inches instead of 7 inches. One of the other things that the standard mentions about the ear is that the ear lies close to the head, and when it's brought forward, it reaches the inner corner of the eye on the same side. So generally, except maybe Skylar's ear, which if we think about it as being the same length as Beulah's ear, her head overall and her body are smaller, so it's not really surprising that maybe her ear would come in a little bit further not reaching the corner of the eye, but coming in a little further. So I think that maybe her ears, relative to the size of her head, are a little larger.
In the set.
I think it's really also important to note that some of the measurements we took and some of these notes, like when we're bringing the ear into the inside corner of the eye, that the ear set may have a big impact on whether we can bring our ear into the inside of the eye or further, or whether we have a broader measurement from the top of the ear across the top of the head. So ear set is actually really important as well. And you can see that I think there's generally similar, but maybe Sky's ear set is a little lower. So the ears are supposed to be, according to the standard, at the same level as the brow or slightly higher. So one of the things that we learned was that most of the dogs we're showing you today, their ears are a little low. You can see that Sky's are the lowest. Hers are probably a little underneath the level of her brow. But if we come over and look at True, hers are maybe just at the level of her brow. And then we come over to McCoy. We see about the same thing. Maybe turn his head maybe towards me a little more. Yeah, that his eyes, he's a little recalcitrant here, but his eyes are also about at the level of his brow.
Ears.
His ears are also about at the level of his brow. Okay, so coming back, we're now going to talk about the muzzle. Most important aspects of the head, because I think the length and shape of the muzzle can really change the overall appearance of the head. And so let's measure. There are a lot of things the standard says about the dimensions of the muzzle. It does say the muzzle's clean cut, so it should have short hair across the whole muzzle. And it says it should be broad throughout its length. So that means to me that the muzzle should not be tapered. The width or the measurement of the muzzle at the base of the muzzle should be similar to the measurement at the tip of the muzzle. So are we going to measure the muzzle, or do you want to use the little ruler? You have a tape measure. You can see that we have a little soft tape measure. I forgot to show the ruler, but we can show the ruler. We have the little soft tape measure, which I think is a handy thing if you don't have one of these. The other thing we have is I found a very small ruler, which I thought was very apropos. This ruler says no other breed measures up to a Newf, and has little Newfoundland heads on it. And then if you turn it around, it turns out that this ruler was a gift from a vendor at the 1999 NCA National Specialty in Solomons, Maryland, which is a very, very long time ago, although I'm sure some people remember it. This is the first national where Steve and I went to the national and showed a dog. So that was about, 21 years ago. And anyone who was there probably remembers that at that national here in Connecticut. And if it was a day like this in Michigan, it would have been a beautiful day for Best of Breed. But anyone who remembers the Solomons National maybe remembers that the day of Best of Breed was bitterly cold and slightly rainy. And Pouch Cove's Toad Hall Joe and Karen Romano were the Best of Breed winners that day. But anyway, I thought that ruler was a little reminder of the past. So now we're going back to looking at the muzzle. So Steve's going to measure the muzzle.
So what do you want first?
Yeah, that's a good idea. So when we measure from the top, we're going to look at the muzzle from the top.
Well, also you can see like a bit of a taper when you...
Yeah, you can see a little bit of a taper when you look at the muzzle from the top. So let's measure the muzzle.
What do you want? Which dimension? What do you want first?
Let's measure across the breadth of the muzzle.
Okay.
So at the base, Beulah's. And then I thought it was the base of the muzzle. It's about 3 inches. So Beulah's muzzle does taper a little bit, 3.5. And then the other thing we wanted to measure was the depth of the muzzle.
So shut your mouth.
It's a little different than the standard mentions are about the same. So her like depth is about 4. And did we measure the length of her muzzle? So we didn't. So there's actually 4 measurements of the muzzle, lots of measuring for the muzzle length and depth. And that's what the standard asks for. It says that the muzzle should be deep and that the depth and length are approximately the same. So one of the things that was also, Beulah and McCoy have pretty much the same muzzle in terms of measurement, although they look a little bit different in their head. So I find that measuring these heads wasn't as helpful as I thought it would be in discriminating differences in their appearance. And it reminds you that looking at heads and judging them is very subjective. One person's favorite head might not be the same as someone else's favorite head. So let's just quick watch McCoy's measurements. So we found that his muzzle was about 4 inches long.
Width
Was about
4.5, maybe
4.5.
And then here at the taper, maybe more like 3.5. And then the depth, not to the base of his flews, but to his jaw underneath it, was again about 4.
And so the measurements of his muzzle are almost exactly the same as Beulah's. It's almost like the same muzzle, but on a very different appearing head. So this is something that I think is kind of interesting, that maybe measuring doesn't tell you as much as you would hope in terms of being able to discriminate between heads. Now, one thing I forgot to mention in our last video was the previous group of animals that we had were 4 unique girls who had 8 different parents. So no siblings, no mother and daughter or father. They were all unique. 4 unique bitches and 4 unique dogs were their parents. In this case, that's not true. We still have that case with the bitches, but McCoy is actually Beulah's father. So maybe that explains why they have such similar muzzles. So looking a little bit at a slightly different muzzle, we could look at True. It turned out that Sky's muzzle had about the same measurements as Beulah as well, but True, on the other hand,
Let's see.
we're going to measure True. True's a little smaller bitch.
So
You can see that True's muzzle, the length of her muzzle is 3 inches.
width. Hold still. It was more like
Is about 3 inches. And then, sorry, True doesn't want to hold her head steady. The width of her muzzle at the base was about 2.5 inches.
hold still.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then the depth of her muzzle was 3 inches. So again, there wasn't as much variability between heads, where True's head, I think, is pretty different looking than Beulah's head. And True's head is a little smaller, but it's within proportion of her body. So I think that's another thing that's really important to note, is you want the head to be in proportion to the body. So you wouldn't want to necessarily place Beulah's head on True's body, because it wouldn't be in proportion with the rest of her. So you want to be able to look at the overall animal like we're looking at Beulah's outline and see a head that fits the size of the rest of the animal. Okay, so there's a lot of measuring in muzzles, but the interesting part is, did it really tell us anything? I found the muzzles were a little bit more to be. I thought there would be more variability. And I'll be very interested to see if anyone else measures their dogs at home, if they do have some variability. The last thing that the standard says about the muzzle is that the top is rounded. So I think this is when we look at the muzzle over the top, we see it rounded here. But that in profile, it should be level, or maybe only have a slight round or a slight slope to it. So the bridge in profile should be straight. So it was interesting because there were a lot of measurements of muzzle, but I don't know that they really told us as much as I thought they would about the overall head. So we talked about the eyes, we talked about the ears, and we talked about the muzzle we wanted to make, but I still wanted to take, to me, these faces are pretty different. And so I think it comes again to remind us how subjective the head is. So what is really important about the Newfoundland maybe is that soft expression that has the benevolence and the kindness.
Intelligence, Beulah.
And especially the rounded head and the square muzzle. A muzzle that is very pretty is almost like a box, where its length and depth and width are in a lot of these girls' cases. So I wish that I had a difference in measurements and how they revealed a difference in the appearance of the head, but it's interesting that they really didn't.
We got a runner.
Moving on to Sky. Sky's head, to me, looks quite different than Beulah's head, and it's actually those measurements that we measured in the standard were all quite similar. So maybe some of the things that are a little harder to measure are more important, like the color and shape of the eye. Color and shape of the eye and how the actual ear positioning, a slightly higher ear, and how that affects the appearance overall of the head. I think Sky looks like she has a very domey head here. Like there's a lot here, but is part of that because her ear is set a little lower? It's hard to say.
There's two comments that came in.
Yeah.
One, somebody said, what about back skull? What's its meaning and what's its purpose? So I would take, do you mind?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I kind of almost will link back skull with that fancy word occiput or occipital bone. It's this knobby little bone way along the back of the skull. And this is something I can't point to it. You have to feel it on your own dog. That along the top of the skull, there's this kind of crest, the sagittal crest, where the two parts have fused together when they were young, and then at the very back of it is this occiput. That's, how well developed that is the back skull. How much room there is for muscle to lay in along that crest gives the width to the skull and that filling out of the crown, because this is where those I forget the name of the muscle that really drives really strong jaws in the dog. And so a dog with a really well-developed crest and occiput where those muscles can attach in is going to have a good width to their skull and strong back skull in the back. So that was the one question. I hope that, I don't know if anyone else wants to
There was also a question about bite.
There was. In fact, I think two people said about bite,
but we can,
and I'll let you handle that.
Yeah. So bite, we weren't necessarily going to talk about it because bite is sort of more general, but you want to show Beulah's bite. So if you look at Beulah's bite, you can see that it looks like a pretty correct bite. And Newfoundland, we don't count teeth in judging. We don't look from the side at the occlusion, but we do look at the front of the bite. So Steve, can we do True's bite?
We got juniors. They know how to show bites.
Oh, they do. So I would say True's bite is True's bite a scissors bite too?
Stop.
I'm not that good at determining these bites.
Yeah.
So True's bite is a scissor bite too. I don't know if we have a level bite here to show you.
We got old dog bite.
Yeah, here's McCoy's bite. Some of his teeth look a little worn down. Again, I would say that's a scissor bite. So I guess I just should have brought somebody with a level bite. We do have, I can show you Sky's bite, but Sky's, when she was little, her bite was normal, but now that she's older, her mouth doesn't quite close anymore. So that's what we call kind of a sketchy bite. It doesn't really fall into the approved categories of scissors or level. But when dogs are older, sometimes their bite changes a little bit. I think Sky likes to push her tongue against her teeth and so has kind of shoved them out of alignment over time. Okay, did we have any more questions that we were seeing?
I'm looking if there is. Yeah, I don't know.
So one of the last things I wanted to mention, which is sort of related to head, is the neck. So the neck is supposed to be strong, and it is supposed to have enough length for proud head carriage, which is how it relates to head. So
somebody said, did I miss ear set?
Oh, we can talk about ear set again.
You want to do the neck first?
Yeah.
So
when we're talking, and this is definitely something that is important in terms of when your dog is traveling around the ring and carrying their head, it makes them look like they're dignified. It makes it look like a Newfoundland when the dog is carrying their head in the air and looks regal. I think it's something that we really appreciate in our Newfoundlands, the proud head carriage. And so it's important to have enough neck to have proud head carriage. I think Beulah has a pretty reasonable looking length of neck. I don't know if we want to try to show, we could show Sky and True. I guess I would say McCoy of these animals probably has the least length of neck. So we get a little bit less of a proud head carriage. You can see that I guess it looks like he has some neck, but you can see that his neck is a little shorter than the girls. So did you want to, Steve, try to talk about the ear set more?
So ear set. And we kind of touched a little. Did you want to go? So You know, the standard says that the ears should be level with or slightly above the brow. And if you look in the illustrated guide, when they're showing that, the dog's muzzle is actually slightly pointing down. And so if we do that, you know, Beulah's ears, and like the others, they're just about at the brow. So I think our dogs maybe are a little bit lower. Joanne was pointing out, you know, and this ties into the question about back skull, that the broader the width is in the back of the skull is going to influence that ear set. Because if the head's really narrow, then those ears might seem to sit up a little bit higher, and it's more of a reach to, so they'll seem smaller almost because they have to reach further to get to inside of the ear. If you have a really broad head that's pushing out.
Move your one hand out of the way a little.
Sorry.
That's okay.
If you have a really broad head in the back that's pushing those ears forward, they're going to seem a little bit larger because they're dropping, and they can reach further to get to the inside. So there is a tie-in with that back skull and the muscle that's built in here, and how it makes the ear set seem,
Another thing that I think is kind of important and fascinating about this is how Newfoundlands don't do this as much as some other breeds do, but how they use their ears can really influence this. So if you have a bait like Joanne just did, you can see the ears move, and sometimes when the Newfoundlands are relaxed, they may have their ears down, and then when they are excited, like when Joanne threw that piece of food, you see the ears go up. So you also have to consider that when you're looking at ear set 2, be different when she's looking at a cookie on the ground than it does when she's just laying around the house.
Doesn't neck also depend on shoulder set? And yeah, like if
it definitely
we ever
does.
Do something where we talk a lot about angulation in the fronts, I think we can circle back to the neck there pretty much.
Yeah, so definitely we had thought about having another future conversation where we talked about angulation and balance, and we can talk about fronts and how necks play in if we have interest in doing that at some time in the future. But I do think that we focused on a lot of parts of the head. I don't know if it has been explained as much about heads as I had hoped. I think one of the things that I found to be very interesting was that 4 heads that to me are so very different, the measurements of them were so very similar. So there's McCoy's slobbery face, and you know, we definitely wanted to include McCoy just so we could see the difference between a dog head and a bitch head. You can see that True's head is a lot more feminine than McCoy's and is smaller and more in keeping with the size and shape of her body. The same with Sky's head. For a smaller bitch, you can see that her head is more appropriate for the size and shape of her body, and Beulah's head, of course.
Just right.
So I definitely enjoyed this, and please feel free to ask questions or comments, make comments, and we will try to answer them if we can. And definitely, I think it would be fun to see other people measure their dogs' heads and comment or put pictures of heads you like. You know, definitely in this group, it's hard for me to make a call. I really love Beulah's head. Maybe Sky's head might be my favorite because it's just so cute. But I think all 4 of them are very appropriate Newfoundland heads. But I think that 4 different people might have 4 different favorite heads here. So I think one of the things that I've learned, a lot of the measurements listed in the standard, and consider them for your Newfoundland, it may still be very subjective as a judge's preference when they're looking at a Newfoundland's face. Some people may really value the expression, the eyes, different aspects of the breed. So thank you guys for watching, and we hope you enjoyed heads, and we're hoping to do some enjoying them. Please feel free to leave suggestions of other topics that you would like to see. We're house, and we really miss seeing everybody for Best of Breed today. That would have been happening in Michigan, and we're really looking forward to when we get to see people at dog shows again, Michigan in 2021, and hoping we have as beautiful a day there as we did here today. So I hope you let us know in the comments if there are other topics you would like to see us talk about with the Newfoundlands.